If we were to do a section through the abdomen, then we'll see these peritoneal cavities, the greater and lesser sac, and the various compartments in more detail. Now, what is this rather complicated diagram on the screen? Well, this is a section, a sagittal section through the abdomen. And here we've got the vertebral column. So this is posterior. We've got the vertebral column. We've got the aorta. This is the diaphragm here, and the liver, the stomach, the transverse colon. This is just a part of small intestines. And here we've got the pancreas. Here we can see the bladder, and we've got the rectum, and this is going to be the anterior abdominal wall. Now, the peritoneum lines the anterior abdominal wall. It lines the anterior abdominal wall. So here we can see we've got parietal peritoneum, just in green here, parietal peritoneum. Now, if we were to follow that, if we were to follow it all the way up, we'd see it run over the underside of the diaphragm. We'd then importantly see it actually run down to attach to the liver. And this is an important transition between parietal peritoneum and visceral peritoneum, with the visceral peritoneum now running over the liver. We can see this piece of green is completely continuous, and we have parietal peritoneum, and we now have visceral peritoneum. The same continuous sheet, but the visceral peritoneum is over the organ, parietal peritoneum over the body wall. We can then follow that and see that it extends away from the liver to the stomach. So we can see we now have a layer that's going from the liver to the stomach. We can then follow it all the way around the stomach, and then dangling down from the stomach, we find we have this membrane, this apron-like membrane that's running down from the stomach. Once it gets inferiorly, it then runs back up, and it goes over the transverse colon towards the posterior abdominal wall, in line with the pancreas, and then it returns towards the transverse colon, surrounds it, and then runs back to the pancreas. So what we've described is the lesser omentum here. We've described the lesser omentum here. We've described the greater omentum here. Lesser omentum, the greater omentum. Remember these peritoneal structures that are suspending the liver. We can then see that running back towards the pancreas and then running towards the transverse colon, we have found the transverse mesocolon, suspending the transverse colon. We can then follow this parietal peritoneum down in this direction, and we see how we have these two layers that are along the posterior abdominal wall, and they're radiating over the small intestine. So we have parietal peritoneum, and we have visceral peritoneum. And what we've got here is the mesentery. We can now see how these mesenteries allow these organs to move around within the abdomen. Now, everything in this space here, this free space, is known as the greater sac. Is known as the greater sac. If we now look at the peritoneum that's forming this lesser sac, we can now look at it in blue. The same principles have applied, but this time we're now posterior to the stomach. We can see we have it running parietal peritoneum here over the diaphragm. It's then connecting to the liver, and then it's running over the liver here as visceral peritoneum. It then runs towards the stomach, where we've now got the lesser omentum again, running over the stomach, the underside of the stomach here, to run on the inside of the greater omentum, and then it's running up back towards the posterior abdominal wall. And all of this in here is the lesser sac, or the omental bursa. The lesser sac, or the omental bursa. And if you remember from the previous slide, these two sacs can communicate. This is the lesser omentum. This is the lesser omentum, which we can see here, lesser omentum between the liver and the stomach. And in this slide, we can see the lesser omentum from the liver and the stomach. And we can communicate the greater sac here, greater sac, can communicate with the lesser sac via the epiploic foramen or the omental foramen. And that's just going to be a little aperture here that allows us to communicate from the greater sac to the lesser sac. Greater sac towards the lesser sac. We can also pick up some other important peritoneal ligaments. Remember, a peritoneal ligament is a double layer. We've got a layer here and a layer here. And this, importantly, is our coronary ligament. And we'll look at that in more detail when we'll come to the liver. So we can see we've got a whole series of greater omentum, lesser omentum. We've got the greater sac, we've got the lesser sac. And we can see we'll be able to develop the idea of peritoneal ligaments. The final part I want to do just on this section is looking at the greater sac again and this supracolic and infracolic compartments. This is relatively straightforward. All you have to do is just lift out the transverse mesocolon and the greater omentum and form this kind of separation in this kind of direction. Everything down here is the infracolic compartment and everything above is the supracolic compartment. So we can see that in the infracolic compartment, we've got the colon, we've got the small intestines. And in the supracolic compartment, we've got the stomach, we've got the liver, for example. Just different regions of the abdomen within this greater sac.